Hi, I'm Chris, and this is my devlog, where I've foolishly embarked on a journey to build my dream game with almost no game dev experience. The game is a 2D side-scrolling RPG named It Begins With Mana, and has already come a long way from the start of our journey. In our first episode, we started with a blank Unity project and created our player, introducing a player controller script and some basic animations. The second episode got rid of our boring background and brought the world of our game to life with a parallaxing scene for our first map. And in today's episode, we are finally going to add our first enemies to the game. We're going to do this by introducing an enemy controller script that uses a finite state machine to have our enemies patrol their surroundings and swap between walking and idle states. Sounds easy, right? Well, as with every episode so far, this one has no shortage of low lows and high highs. But with all that said, let's get into it. Welcome back to Could I Code? As mentioned in the intro, today's episode is going to focus on adding our first enemy to our game. And what's particularly exciting is that today's video, more than any of our previous episodes, is going to rely directly on advice that was provided in the comments by our wonderful community. There are two specific pieces of advice that will influence today's video. First, focusing on the code first and then implementing the art assets once things are working as intended. This is a fairly obvious one, and a lot of people have provided this advice in varying ways since the start of the series. I believe the true experienced game dev approach would be to make the entire prototype before diving into art assets, but my compromise that I hope will be accepted is framing the episodes around focusing on implementing the code mechanics first and then the art assets afterwards. The second piece of advice is building the enemy controller script with the use of a finite state machine. This advice came from two different community members, pointing me towards a state machine for a variety of different mechanics and towards a YouTube channel named Bardent, and man, this was an amazing resource to stumble across. As you'll see throughout this implementation, I rely heavily on Bardent's content to get our enemies working, and there are many more lessons from their channel that I'm interested in using for future mechanics for the game. So I guess the first thing we should discuss is how the enemies in our game will work. There will be both basic enemies and boss enemies. Basic enemies will have minimal mechanics and be relatively plentiful on specific maps where they can be grinded for XP and quest objectives. Bosses will have specific spawn locations or processes to be summoned, have more unique mechanics, and be significantly less frequent to encounter. This map that we are working on is fairly early in the game and therefore is not an ideal lair for any bosses, so today's enemies are definitely basic. Specifically, we will be adding the Mana Weaver enemy, a type of spider that prefers caves and forests and regions that are rich with mana. They are very basic as they only do touch damage, however, they do have a relatively quick movement speed. Now, as stated earlier, the old Chris would begin this process by designing and animating the Mana Weavers, but today we're going to start with the coded mechanics first and finish with the visuals. So with that in mind, I opened Bardent's video on 2D platformer basic enemies and began to follow along. This tutorial had us implement an enemy as two separate game objects, a parent object with the enemy controller attached to it, and a child game object that would house the other components and the actual sprite, which at this point was just a square. A very menacing square. I copied over most of the settings from our player's rigid body and box collider so that the enemy would interact with the map in a similar fashion to our player. Now, this tutorial from Bardent also dealt with combat, such as damaging the player and enemy. But to keep this episode to a manageable length, we will only be dealing with the enemy creation and movement today, and then dealing with combat and deaths in a future episode. And just like that, we had a square that we could push around. Maybe this is their origin story for turning evil. It was now time to make our basic enemy controller script. Again, this script is using a finite state machine, which I had never heard of before beginning this episode, and it took a lot of back and forth with the tutorial to get right. However, as we began to set things up, I started to see the real power that could be housed in a system like this, and the ease at which you could expand upon it simply by adding new states to the script. I also gained a lot of perspective in terms of how a longer script like this could be laid out to avoid getting lost scrolling through it when coming back to make edits to the code. The tutorial script included a knockback and dead state that we wouldn't be using quite yet, so we mostly focused on building out the walking state. What I particularly liked about the finished product was how intuitive it was to build out functions into it. You had all of these states and specific moments within the state to call functions from, either when the state starts, ends, or while the actual state is happening. Similar to our player, we built out a ground detection system to help the enemy know when it was about to walk off platforms. We also added a wall detection system so that it knew when to turn around if it ran into something. It turned around by using a handy flip function that we could insert into any state where it was needed. Eventually, we went back into Unity and created our game objects to be used for the wall and ground checks. We added values for the ground check distance, the wall check distance, and the movement speed, and then finally went to go hit play. And as is tradition at this point, nothing happened. The square just sat there like the inanimate object it was. It was time for everyone's favorite coding step, debugging the situation. I went back to the tutorial video and ensured that every step that was relevant to my current setup was included. This included adding these gizmo drawline functions that visually showed the ground and wall checks, which was a very handy debugging feature. I did notice a couple of errors in my code, such as the switch state function just being named switch, so I went and changed that. This didn't solve things, so it was time to add the debug.log checks to see where the script was breaking down. I put a check to see if the else statement that would make the square move was being triggered, and it wasn't. I was getting a bit desperate, and I wondered if the script wasn't properly attached to the game object, so I just checked that the start function was firing correctly, and it was. I then checked the walking update function, and it was firing as well. I took the movement code out of the else statement and put it into the walking update, and we had movement, but it was crazy, jerky, back and forth movement. And that's when it hit me. The initial ground and wall check if statement was continuously being triggered, preventing the movement code in the else statement from being triggered and continuously calling the flip function. I commented out the flip function and confirmed that this was the case by not having jerky movement. So we just needed to adjust the ground and wall checks. I removed the wall and ground check conditions from the if statement separately and determined that it was the ground check causing the square not to move. I tried to work with the wall check first, as the square was at least moving, though we had the opposite issue of the square not flipping when it hit the walls. This initial fix was easy, as my wall check was looking for objects as part of the ground layer, and I simply needed to mark the walls as part of that layer. With this, the right wall worked for the flip, but not the left wall. Even weirder, if I used the player to push the square further into the left wall, it would work. It took me a really long time to figure out what was causing this issue, and it ended up actually being a small issue with the tutorial's code. I went through the comments and found someone experiencing a similar issue to me, which is a critical step if you ever do run into an issue while implementing a tutorial. Someone else has likely had the same issue that you are having. I found a solution in the comments as well, a small tweak to the code, and the wall check raycast would now flip based on the enemy movement direction. With that, we could flip on the left and right wall. Also, it turned out that the ground check issue mentioned earlier was the way easier problem to solve, as I simply needed to move the ground check game object closer to the ground, and we were up and running. So we now had a square that could detect and flip when it hit walls or ran out of platform. It seems like a lot of time to get to this point, but here we are. This is also where I decided to go out on my own and experiment with the state machine a bit. See, I didn't want to implement a dead or knockback state yet, but I did want to implement an idle state. I wanted my enemies to do more than simply walk back and forth patrolling. I wanted some randomness. So I created a new idle state and used a timer similar to the timer Bardent uses for the knockback state in his tutorial to control how long the enemy walks and remains idle. However, I didn't want these to be static values as I wanted each copy of the enemy to feel independent from one another. So at the enter walk or enter idle state, I used a random range function to pick a new walk time and a new idle duration every time the enemy switched states. Also, I definitely didn't need to read the Unity documentation to figure out how to use the random range function, so don't even worry about that. Eventually, we had a square that would switch between the walking and idling state randomly after a random range of seconds between each of these different states. The final piece of code that I wanted to add at this stage was randomly flipping the direction of the enemy when it came out of the idle state. That way, it would be a lot more challenging to predict its next move, as you didn't simply know it was going to continue in the same direction until it got to the end of a platform or to a wall. I did this by essentially having a coin flip using a random range that was called when entering the walking state. Depending on the flip value, it would change direction or stay moving in the same direction. This was really quick to add and worked right away. I guess I kind of paid my debugging dues early in this episode with all the ground and wall check stuff. With all the coding done, it was time to upgrade from this square and create some new art assets and animations for our enemy. As with all of the assets I've created for this game so far, I created the Mana Weaver asset in Procreate. And although I had a very rough pencil sketch from my notebook, I decided to start with a new pencil sketch in the app to get the shaping right. I also hope to one day have an in-game enemy wiki system that relies on these pencil sketches, so it was in part planning for the future that I wanted to make a new digital pencil layer. Once the pencil sketch was done, I inked the outlines and started adding color, bringing the creature to life. The legs were a challenge, and unlike the underlying pencil layer, I decided to simply copy the front four legs to be used as the back four legs, to keep them the same length for the bone rigging process in Unity. The hardest part of this entire asset was capturing the mana portion of the Mana Weaver. I initially wanted the body to glow blue, but finding a glow that wasn't too intense or too subtle was very challenging. I experimented with some body marks and ended up really liking the look of some mana-colored stripes on the body and head as kind of a pop of color. Once the asset was created in Procreate, I brought it over to Krita to organize the layers, and then to Photopea to convert it from a PSD file to a PSB file that could be imported directly into Unity. Once imported into Unity, I spent a ridiculous amount of time playing with the import settings to get the Mana Weaver to an acceptable scale relative to the player. I'll confess that I initially imagined them being smaller than the size I settled on, but I believe it is difficult to have them too small while still doing justice to the details of their legs. After I settled on a size, it was time to rig and animate, and man, if I thought these steps were difficult for my player character with 2 legs, I was not prepared for what 8 legs would be like. When rigging, I had to be very strategic with hiding certain sprite and bone layers to keep track of which bone I was actively working on. Adding inverse kinematics was cumbersome with the amount of legs, but not too bad, even if some of the legs went a little bit wonky before I flipped them. I also have to give another shout out to the Unity rigging tutorial that I keep going back to from TerraDev. It is truly a great resource for these steps. The idle animation was easy enough with just needing to adjust the root and head bones to get a very fluid animation. The walking animation took a lot more effort, and I'm sure it could still be improved with more time, but hey, it looks different than the idle animation, and it feels like the creature is moving, so we're going with it. Soon enough, I had a default idle animation set up and working in-game, and it looked pretty good. The next step was to bring over all of the tech we had put together for our square over to our Mana Weaver. I'm sure there was an easier way to go about doing this, but I brought it over one component at a time, making sure that nothing broke at each step along the way. I did have to fiddle around with the ground check a fair bit to stop the Mana Weaver from freaking out, but at least I had experience from my previous debugging session with the square to know what was likely causing the issue. Though I could still make it freak out by pushing it into the sky, which was kind of fun to do. I then added some simple animator bool variables that signal to our animator controller when the player would swap between idle and walking. Believe it or not, this was way easier to do with a specific state for each of these 2 actions already built out in our code. And just like that, we had a Mana Weaver that could walk and be idle and would transition between these 2 states randomly like our square did. Next, I needed to add more mana weavers, but before that, I needed to make it so that my enemies wouldn't physically collide with the player or other enemies. I did this by adjusting the layer overrides in the rigid body component of the mana weaver. This had the desired effect, and we now had enemies that could be passed through, meaning they could eventually be mobbed and grinded by our player. I had one issue though, where the final enemy I was adding was falling through the ground. I couldn't figure out why this was the case, as the enemy was set up the same way as the others, and the ground platform was already a part of the ground layer that shouldn't be excluded by the rigid body. Eventually, I found a fix by adding the same platform effector 2D component that the other platforms had and simply not enabling the use one-way option. And just like that, we had success. We not only had a map environment that felt like it brought my game's vision to life, but now had living creatures just waiting for our player to interact with them. And that leads us to our next episode, where we'll be focusing on combat by adding to both of our player and enemy controllers to make some exciting interactions happen. But before we end, I want to close this video with some final thoughts. Firstly, I want to say how much I appreciate everyone who has joined this community and is partaking in my game dev journey. I'm really moved by all of your enthusiasm, support, and above all, your patience. I know I've been really slow at getting out new episodes, but I hope you appreciate that I'm trying to progress this project while continuing to do everything in my life that I normally do. As you can see in the background footage, I went on a ski trip recently, something I do for a few days every year with my family and friends, and it gave me the space to think about the bigger picture of this project. On the one hand, I'm very excited with all of the progress my game and my YouTube channel have made so far in 2025, and there is certainly pressure to strike while the iron is hot. However, I know from similar projects and my own work ethic that I am better at a slow and steady approach. I think giving a project time and taking small breaks to catch your breath is an essential part to continuing to show up and having the same enthusiasm week after week, and at the moment, that is my approach. So, although I'd love to go crazy and push things forward as quickly as I can, I know that isn't realistic or even the best strategy for me to continue progressing on this project. I hope you understand that and can continue to enjoy updates at the pace that I can deliver them. And I hope that you find time in your own life to take small breaks to catch your breath. You deserve them, and even resting can be productive in the long term. As always, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next episode. Bye.